Hira had walls, wealth, churches, fortified compounds, and centuries of political importance. But when Khalid ibn al-Walid reached the city in 633, the hardest question facing its leadership was not simply whether those defenses could resist an assault. The more dangerous question was what resistance would achieve. For generations, Hira had stood on the southwestern edge of the Sasanian world. Its rulers had defended Persian interests, controlled routes between Iraq and Arabia, supplied troops, managed tribal relationships, and helped shield the agricultural heartland of Mesopotamia from threats emerging from the desert. That system had already been dismantled before Khalid arrived. The old Lakhmid dynasty was gone. Sasanian authority had passed through war, deposition, assassination, civil conflict, and repeated military crises. Persian forces still existed and could still defeat invading armies. But the political structure that had once made Hira part of a functioning frontier defense network was no longer operating with the same reliability. Now an army from Arabia was moving through southern Iraq. Several Sasanian positions had already been challenged or defeated. Communities were being forced to decide whether to fight, negotiate, provide intelligence, pay tribute, or risk being taken by force. Hira was important enough to resist. It was also important enough to lose everything if resistance failed. The surviving accounts do not describe a simple story of heroic defense followed by overwhelming conquest. They preserve competing versions. Some describe fortified resistance before negotiations. Another tradition says Hira reached terms without offering meaningful resistance. That disagreement matters. Because Hira was not primarily destroyed in 633. It was transferred. Its leaders accepted a new political authority, agreed to payments and accepted obligations toward the invading army. In exchange, later accounts state that Khalid guaranteed the survival of the city's churches and fortified structures. The conquest of Hira was therefore not the absence of violence. It was violence operating as leverage. The destruction that had already occurred elsewhere made negotiation credible. And for one of the most important Arab cities of late Sasanian Iraq, survival would depend on recognizing that the empire it had once helped defend could no longer guarantee its defense. Long before the Muslim conquests, Hira existed because geography made it useful. It stood near the boundary between the cultivated lands of Lower Mesopotamia and the Arabian Desert, southeast of the later site of Kufa, and close to the region of modern Najaf. This was not a remote desert settlement. It occupied an interface between two military environments. To the east and northeast lay the irrigated territory of the Sasanian-controlled Sawad. Canals, agricultural estates, settlements, roads, administrative centers, and routes leading toward the imperial capital at Ctesiphon. To the west and southwest lay the open approaches toward Arabia. An empire attempting to control Iraq could not treat that frontier as an empty line on a map. It needed intermediaries. The Lakhmid rulers of Hira performed that function for centuries. They were Arab rulers connected to the Sasanian monarchy, but describing them merely as Persian servants understates their role. They possessed their own political authority, military forces, tribal relationships, territory, court culture, and diplomatic importance. Their value to the Sasanians came precisely from the fact that they could operate in a political environment that Persian imperial administration could not easily control directly. The Lakhmids dealt with Arab tribes. They guarded approaches toward the settled lands. They fought the Ghassanids, the Arab allies of Byzantium. They supported Sasanian campaigns. They helped police routes extending toward Persian positions in eastern Arabia. Sources describe military formations associated with Hira that included Arab troops as well as Persian contingents and heavily equipped cavalry. This was frontier defense by delegation. The Sasanians did not need to station the entire imperial field army along the desert edge. If a regional Arab dynasty could absorb pressure, negotiate with tribes, punish raiders, and mobilize forces before threats reached the deeper agricultural and administrative centers of Iraq. Hira also mattered for reasons that cannot be reduced to military geography. It contained a major Christian population. A bishop is documented there by the early 5th century. Churches and monasteries became important features of the region. Arab Christian communities formed an influential part of Hira's population, alongside Aramaic-speaking inhabitants and Arab tribal groups. The city was a cultural contact zone where Sasanian Persian, Syriac Christian, and Arab traditions interacted. That combination made Hira valuable. It also made it vulnerable. Frontier centers survive when the larger system behind them continues to function. If that larger system breaks down, the same city that once connected an empire to its border can become an exposed gateway into the empire itself. In 602, Khosrow II removed the last Lakhmid king, al-Nu'man III. The exact political circumstances surrounding al-Nu'man's fall became surrounded by later stories, some of them regarded with suspicion by modern historians. What is clear is the institutional result. The Lakhmid monarchy ended. Sasanian authority over Hira became more direct. From the perspective of imperial centralization, the decision could appear rational. A client ruler could become unreliable. Direct government offered the possibility of stronger control. But direct control required the empire to perform functions that the Lakhmids had previously performed for it. The frontier did not disappear when the client kingdom disappeared. Its military problems remained. Its tribal relationships remained. Its desert approaches remained. The administrative decision of 602 therefore removed an established buffer without removing the conditions that had made that buffer necessary. Encyclopedia Iranica goes so far as to describe Khosrow's deposition of al-Nu'man as weakening Sasanian defenses on the southwestern flank. It would be too simple to claim that one decision in 602 caused the Muslim conquest 3 decades later. The Sasanian Empire did not immediately collapse. It remained capable of launching enormous military operations against Byzantium, occupying major Roman territories, taking Jerusalem, advancing into Egypt, and threatening Constantinople. The problem was what those wars cost. The long conflict between Khosrow II and the Byzantine Empire consumed soldiers, money, logistical capacity, political loyalty, and administrative stability. By the final years of Khosrow's reign, military families had endured prolonged service and losses. Economic interests faced disruption. Taxation had increased. Political resentment was growing. Then the strategic situation reversed. Byzantine counteroffensives under Heraclius struck deep into Sasanian territory. Persian military setbacks undermined Khosrow's position. In 628 he was removed and executed. The end of the emperor did not restore stability. It opened another crisis. Competing factions and rulers struggled for control of the Sasanian state. Central authority weakened further during the years immediately before the Arab invasions. By the time Yazdegerd III reached the throne in 632, the empire still possessed armies, aristocratic military houses, fortified cities, agricultural wealth, and an imperial administrative tradition. What it lacked was time to reconstruct a frontier system that had already been altered before the civil crisis began. This is the political environment in which Hira entered the year 633. It was not waiting behind an intact Lakhmid shield. The city was itself part of the exposed frontier, and movement from Arabia had already begun. Later, Muslim historical traditions describe al-Muthanna ibn Haritha and Arab forces associated with him conducting operations along the Iraqi frontier before Khalid's arrival. The chronology is not completely secure. The written conquest narratives survive in works compiled well after the events, and some detailed traditions were transmitted through authorities whose reliability is disputed. Al-Tabari's extensive account of the campaigns, for example, contains substantial material derived from Sayf ibn Umar, whose reports modern scholarship treats with considerable caution. That means precise troop strengths, speeches, battlefield maneuvers, casualty numbers, and even the exact sequence of certain engagements should not automatically be treated as contemporary records. The broad strategic development is much firmer. Early Muslim forces moved into the Sawad. Abu Bakr's government committed Khalid ibn al-Walid to operations in Iraq. Local Arab forces were incorporated into the campaign. Persian garrisons and allied formations were confronted. Settlements were attacked, occupied, or brought into agreements, and the direction of movement increasingly threatened Hira. Khalid brought to Iraq the reputation and operational experience he had gained during the Ridda Wars in Arabia. But the Iraqi campaign was different. This was not simply a continuation of fighting against Arabian tribal coalitions. The invading army was entering a region connected to one of the largest imperial systems in the late antique world. That changed the military problem. Khalid did not need to destroy the entire Sasanian empire to make progress. He needed to fracture its local defensive network faster than the imperial state could restore it. That meant defeating forces when necessary, but also converting settlements into sources of money, intelligence, supplies, guides, and political compliance. Al-Baladuri preserves evidence of this pattern. At Ulais, for example, his account states that terms required the inhabitants to provide assistance as spies, guides, and helpers against Persian forces. This was more than taxation. Intelligence was being extracted from conquered territory. Every settlement that accepted such an agreement potentially reduced the informational advantage of the defenders farther north. Roads became known, canals became known, supply points became known, local political divisions became exploitable. The invading army did not have to arrive with complete knowledge of Lower Mesopotamia if negotiated communities could be compelled to provide it. The later traditional sequence places a number of major clashes in Khalid's advance through Iraq, including engagements usually identified as Dat al-Salasil, al-Madar, Walaja, and Ulais. The details vary between sources. Numbers assigned to the armies are especially difficult to trust. Descriptions of tactical maneuvers may preserve genuine military memory, later reconstruction, or combinations of both. But the cumulative result is clearer than the numerical detail. By the time Khalid approached Hira, the city was not evaluating an unknown army. It was evaluating an army that had already demonstrated the ability to keep moving after combat. That operational momentum mattered. A fortified city does not decide whether to resist based only on the height of its walls. It must consider whether relief is coming. It must consider whether surrounding territory remains friendly. It must consider food. It must consider access to water and routes. It must consider whether an enemy can isolate individual defensive positions. Above all, it must consider whether the political authority demanding resistance can actually support that resistance. Hira's historical relationship with the Sasanians had once provided an answer. By 633, that answer was uncertain. Al-Baladuri preserves more than one account of Khalid's approach. In one version, Khalid moved toward a place described as the confluence of canals, where he encountered Azadbi, identified as responsible for Persian frontier fortifications between Persian and Arab territory. Fighting followed, and the Persian side was defeated. Another tradition presents Khalid as moving more directly toward Hira. This difference should not be artificially resolved. The sources are telling us that the operational picture was remembered in competing ways. What can be stated more safely is that organized Sasanian control around Hira was unable to prevent Khalid's army from reaching the city itself. At Hira, later accounts identify several local figures involved in the negotiations. Among them were Abd al-Masih ibn Amr ibn Qais ibn Hayyan ibn Buqayla, Hani ibn Qabisa, and Iyas ibn Qabisa al-Ta'i, although some transmitted versions give a different name in place of Iyas. The tradition also connects Iyas with the Sasanian administration imposed after the removal of al-Nu'man. Again, the disagreement in names is important. This is not a modern military report written immediately after the event. It is a body of remembered conquest traditions compiled and transmitted through later generations. The safest reconstruction is therefore institutional rather than theatrical. Representatives of Hira negotiated. The city possessed fortified positions. The Muslim army had reached those positions after a successful advance, and the result was a settlement rather than the total destruction of the urban center. One account says inhabitants withdrew into several fortified complexes, including the White Palace, Qasr ibn Bukayla, and Qasr al-Adasiyin. The Muslim cavalry then moved through the open areas among the buildings. After this display of military presence, terms were reached. Another report in the same source says the people of Hira concluded terms without resistance. Those versions are not identical. They do, however, establish the limits of what can responsibly be said. There may have been localized resistance. There may have been military pressure around fortified compounds. There may have been brief fighting connected with the approach or the isolation of the defenses. But the surviving evidence does not justify turning Hira into a massive siege followed by a spectacular storming of the walls. Nor does it support confident claims of enormous casualty figures. The decisive event was negotiation. That does not mean the negotiations were free. An army was outside the city. Its advance had already demonstrated what refusal could mean elsewhere. The distinction between voluntary diplomacy and coercive diplomacy becomes thin when one side controls the immediate military initiative. The leadership of Hira was bargaining under pressure. The question was no longer whether the existing political order could be preserved unchanged. It could not. The realistic choices were narrower. Resist and hope that Sasanian power could intervene before the city's defensive position deteriorated, or accept subordination to Khalid's forces and preserve as much of the local urban and religious structure as possible. There is no reliable record of the private calculations inside Hira. We do not know which leader argued for which course. We do not know whether the city's Christian clergy favored one option while military figures favored another. We do not know whether particular neighborhoods wanted resistance. We do not know what ordinary inhabitants were told. Claims about such discussions would be fiction. What survives is the result. Hira made terms, and those terms expose the actual mechanics of early conquest more clearly than a battlefield narrative would. Later traditions disagree on the exact annual payment. One version gives 100,000 dirhams, another gives 80,000. A separate calculation preserved by al-Baladuri describes 6,000 men assessed at 14 dirhams each, producing a total of 84,000 dirhams under the weight standard given in that report. The discrepancies should not be hidden by selecting whichever number appears most convenient. They show that later transmitters preserved different memories of the fiscal arrangement. What matters more than the precise figure is that payment was imposed as a condition of the settlement. The money represented submission in measurable form. Hira would not simply announce neutrality. It would provide revenue. It would also accept obligations connected directly to the continuing war. Al-Baladuri's account says the inhabitants were required to provide intelligence against the Persians. That provision changes the strategic meaning of the agreement. Hira had spent generations participating in a frontier system designed to protect Sasanian Iraq from threats emerging from Arabia. Now knowledge accumulated within that frontier society could be redirected against the Sasanian state. The political inversion was severe. A city that had once helped Persia understand Arabia could now help an Arabian army understand Persia. This was one of the most damaging consequences of losing a frontier center. The buildings might remain, the population might remain, the churches might remain. But the informational infrastructure had changed sides, and intelligence in an unfamiliar theater can be as useful as territory. The agreement also included restrictions on what Khalid's forces would do to Hira. According to the preserved tradition, Khalid undertook not to destroy the city's churches or fortified structures. The terms therefore linked fiscal and strategic submission to physical protection. This was not equality between the two sides. Hira was accepting a subordinate status, but subordinate status was different from devastation. For local elites, clergy, property holders, merchants and families dependent on the city's continued economic life, that difference was substantial. A conquered city is not protected simply because soldiers stop attacking it. Its survival depends on whether the economic network continues functioning after the army moves on. Markets need goods. Agricultural production requires access to fields and canals. Religious institutions require property, clergy, and congregations. Local officials must determine which taxes are now owed, to whom, and through which authority. Travel routes must remain usable. The settlement at Hira was therefore the beginning of occupation, not the end of the problem. A new authority had made demands. The old imperial relationship had been compromised, and the city now had to survive between competing powers whose struggle in Iraq was not finished. This is one reason the capture of Hira should not be presented as evidence that the Sasanian military had ceased to exist. It had not. Persian forces would continue fighting. The Muslim position in Iraq would later come under serious pressure. After Khalid was transferred toward the Syrian theater, the balance in Mesopotamia remained unstable. In 634, at the Battle of the Bridge, a Sasanian army defeated Muslim forces. That defeat alone demonstrates that the events of 633 were not an uninterrupted collapse in which every Persian formation simply disappeared. The conquest of Iraq took years. Major resistance remained. The decisive struggle for central Iraq would come later, particularly at Al-Qadisiyah and the subsequent loss of Ctesiphon. Hira's agreement therefore occurred during the opening phase of a war whose final result was still uncertain. That makes its decision more significant, not less. The city did not wait for the Sasanian Empire to be formally destroyed. Its leaders responded to the local military balance in front of them. For Khalid, the agreement solved several operational problems at once. He avoided the cost of a prolonged urban assault. He obtained revenue. He acquired intelligence obligations. He denied the Sasanians an important Arab frontier center. And he gained a position from which further operations could be conducted deeper into Iraq. The alternative would have been expensive. Even a successful assault could consume time and men. Fortified urban fighting could disrupt command cohesion. Looting could destroy resources that an occupying army needed. A prolonged siege could give Persian commanders time to concentrate forces. An army operating away from its original base had to consider not only whether it could capture a city, but whether the capture would delay the next movement. Negotiated submission reduced that friction. The strategy was therefore not based on mercy alone and not based on violence alone. It combined the credible threat of force with selective agreements. Communities that accepted terms could be integrated into the expanding military system. Communities that continued resistance might face direct assault. This created an incentive structure that spread ahead of the army. Every new settlement could examine what had happened to the previous one. Hira became part of that message. But the dark side of negotiated conquest should not be concealed behind the fact that buildings survived. Payment meant economic extraction. Intelligence obligations meant involvement in the destruction of the former political order. Acceptance of a new military authority could expose local leaders to accusations of collaboration if Sasanian forces returned. The arrangement protected the city from one immediate form of violence while placing it inside a larger war. It also redistributed power internally. Those capable of negotiating with the new rulers gained importance. Those whose position depended primarily on direct Sasanian backing lost leverage. People who had no voice in the agreement still lived under its consequences. The surviving sources name negotiators and commanders far more readily than farmers, craftsmen, clergy of lower rank, servants, women, laborers, and poorer residents. That imbalance is normal in conquest narratives. It is also dangerous. If the history is told only through commanders and treaties, urban survival can sound bloodless. It was not. The people of Hira were watching the authority above them change through military coercion. They were required to fund the new arrangement. They had no guarantee that the wider war would not return. And beyond Hira, other communities would experience very different outcomes. Al-Baladhuri's own conquest narrative records places where settlements were attacked, captives were taken, and resistance brought harsher consequences. Hira's survival was therefore not evidence that the Iraqi campaign was non-violent. It was evidence that conquest produced different outcomes depending on resistance, negotiation, military necessity, and the terms an invading commander was prepared to accept. After securing Hira, Khalid's operations continued. Nearby districts and settlements were brought under pressure. Banikia entered an agreement. Operations extended toward Al-Anbar and Ain al-Tamr. Some places negotiated, others resisted, some were attacked. The campaign moved along a network of settlements, canals, forts, agricultural zones, and tribal territories, rather than across an empty battlefield. This is the geographical reality often lost in simplified maps. Southern Iraq was not a flat space across which two armies moved toward a single decisive collision. It was a populated economic system. Control of that system required more than battlefield victories. It required agreements with local communities. It required access to food. It required horses and fodder. It required knowledge of canals and crossings. It required information about garrisons. It required preventing defeated forces from reorganizing behind the advancing army. Hira's submission contributed to that process. The city became useful precisely because it had not been ruined. This was a basic logic of conquest. A destroyed city could provide loot once. A functioning city could provide taxes, supplies, intelligence, administration, and a strategic base repeatedly. That did not make conquest humane. It made preservation militarily valuable. The distinction is important. Popular history often divides cities into two simple categories. Those that fought are treated as courageous. Those that negotiated are treated as weak. That framework is inadequate for Hira. A leadership responsible for an urban population had to consider consequences that a field commander did not. A field army could withdraw after defeat. A city could not. Its churches could not retreat. Its agricultural land could not retreat. Its workshops could not retreat. Its families could not collectively move beyond the reach of an army simply because the military situation had deteriorated. For Hira, negotiation could be a rational defense policy even if it meant political surrender. The object being defended was no longer Sasanian control. It was the continued existence of the city. That distinction explains why the title of this episode matters. Hira negotiated instead of dying, but it did not negotiate because war had disappeared. It negotiated because war had reached a point where preserving the city required accepting the consequences of defeat before those consequences became irreversible. The larger Sasanian failure can also be seen here in institutional terms. For centuries, the empire had benefited from an Arab client state capable of absorbing instability along the desert frontier. In 602, that system ended. 3 decades later, when another Arab military power entered Iraq, Hira did not function as the center of an autonomous Lakhmid military structure, able to organize a sustained defense on behalf of Persia. The old political machinery was gone. That does not mean the Lakhmid kingdom would necessarily have stopped the Muslim conquests. No source can prove that counterfactual. The caliphate emerging from Arabia had developed military and political capacities very different from earlier tribal raiding forces. The Sasanian crisis was much broader than Hira, but the disappearance of the Lakhmid buffer meant that one layer of defense was no longer available when it was needed most. The empire had centralized a frontier. Then the center became unstable. Hira was left with the consequences. The city's agreement also exposes why the phrase "fall of Persia" can distort the events of the 630s. Empires do not fall everywhere at the same moment. They fragment unevenly. One commander retreats, one garrison resists, one town pays, one tribal group changes allegiance, one district provides guides, another fort holds out. A field army wins a battle months after a nearby city has already negotiated with the enemy. At Hira, Sasanian sovereignty weakened before the Sasanian monarchy itself disappeared. That is how imperial collapse often looks at the local level. The flag does not have to vanish from the entire empire before people begin adjusting to the possibility that the center cannot protect them. The process is transactional. A town calculates. An invading commander makes demands. Local authorities attempt to preserve institutions. The conqueror decides whether those institutions are more useful intact than destroyed. The arrangement is written down. Taxes change direction. Military intelligence changes direction. And on a map drawn centuries later, the event becomes a single color changing to another. The map hides the negotiation. It hides the coercion. It hides the uncertainty. Most of all, it hides the fact that nobody in Hira in 633 could know how the wider war would end. The Sasanian state still had enough strength to launch counterattacks. Its armies would soon prove capable of defeating Muslim forces. Khalid himself would not remain permanently in Iraq. The caliphate had other fronts. Control of Mesopotamia was not yet secure. Hira's leadership was therefore not surrendering to an empire whose final victory was already obvious. It was reacting to the operational situation immediately surrounding the city. That makes the decision more understandable. It also makes it more severe. When a frontier population begins making separate agreements because the central state cannot provide immediate protection, imperial authority is already being hollowed out from below. Hira survived the conquest itself. Its churches and Christian community continued. The settlement remained inhabited into the Islamic period, but political geography changed around it. After the later Muslim consolidation of Iraq, a new military settlement emerged nearby. Kufa would become one of the most important cities of the early Islamic world. Its growth gradually eclipsed Hira. The former Lakhmid capital did not disappear overnight. It declined over centuries. Its greatest political function had belonged to a frontier world that no longer existed. That final outcome contains a paradox. Hira avoided complete destruction in 633, but surviving a conquest does not guarantee surviving the new order created by that conquest. The city's buildings could remain while strategic importance moved elsewhere. Its Christian institutions could continue while the regional political center shifted. Its residents could remain while new military and administrative networks developed around Kufa. The city had successfully negotiated the immediate crisis. History then changed the reason the city had once been important. The Lakhmid capital had existed because the Sasanian Empire needed an Arab frontier intermediary. The Muslim conquest removed that strategic function. Hira was no longer guarding Persia from Arabia. Arab armies were now establishing power inside Iraq itself. The frontier had moved. That is why Hira deserves a different place in military history from battles such as Walaja or Al-Qadisiyah. There is no need to manufacture a spectacular final assault. The historical significance lies elsewhere. A strategically important city examined the military position, recognized that imperial protection had become unreliable, accepted a negotiated submission, and preserved much of its physical and religious infrastructure at the cost of tribute and political obedience. Khalid gained Hira without having to reduce the city to ruins. The inhabitants avoided the worst possible immediate outcome. The Sasanian state lost more than territory. It lost a former frontier center, whose local knowledge and resources could now support the opposing side. No single dramatic battlefield moment explains that transformation. It was created by decades of policy decisions, imperial war, political instability, frontier restructuring, military defeats, local calculations, and the practical economics of conquest. Hira had once been built into the Sasanian defense system because Persian rulers understood that Iraq's desert frontier could not be controlled by walls alone. It required alliances, it required local knowledge, it required Arab intermediaries. It required a political structure capable of making communities believe that defending the empire also meant defending themselves. By 633, that structure had failed. The walls were still there, the churches were still there, the wealth was still there, the people were still there. What was missing was confidence that fighting for Sasanian authority would save any of them. And when Khalid's army reached Hira, the city made the decision that many collapsing empires eventually force upon their frontier populations. It stopped asking whether the old order deserved another battle. It began negotiating the conditions under which life could continue after that order had lost control.